for the second of our COP26 presentations. This is a joint presentation with the Architects Climate Action Network and the Scottish Ecological Design Association. This is a blended event, so bear with us, there may be some technical issues. We have an online audience and an in-person audience, and it's nice to see people in real life again. Let's say this is the second of our COP26 events. Yesterday we had something about indoor air quality and making healthy buildings. This is about decarbonising construction. So I'll introduce myself. My name is Catherine Cosgrove. I'm the chair of the Scottish Ecological Design Association. We've been going for 30 years now. This is our 30th birthday. We've been founded to spread information and knowledge about a wide range of ecological issues which factor into design, and specifically that we've got a holistic view of all these so that they all work together. You have to consider all of these in design. You will find that there's a number of things that we've been doing over the years which are kind of starting to become more important now. People are looking at them and going, well, yeah, that makes sense. There we are. There's the usual suspects. Currently, we've got about 350 members, always looking for more. If you go to our website, you'll find we've got a wide range of resources. So we've got free design guides. We've got a number of other publications which have come out, including, as of yesterday, we've got a design guide that we're talking about for indoor air quality. Many of our events that we have recorded over the last few years are also available as resources on the website. It's SEDA.uk.net if you're interested. And please, we would like more people to join. So if you feel like you can, please join there. We'll ask Eve quickly from Architects Climate Action Network to say a few words.
Hi everyone. I'll keep this brief because I was a bit frazzled by the sound issues before. My name's Eve. I'm the events coordinator at ACAN, Architects Climate Action Network. We are a quite young organisation of 2 years old, and we are a group of individuals working in the built environment industry trying to lobby for some positive change within our industry. And we're very excited to be partnering with SEDA on the second event at the moment, just because we believe that collaboration is definitely the key to kind of get stuff done. We'll be in this space until end of tomorrow, Sunday, if we feel like it. So please feel free to kind of have a look at all the exhibition we've got going on. And last thing I'll point out is that we've within our 2 years we've managed to have offshoots in different locations, and we've been working quite hard with the ACAN Scotland team as well on all this. So yeah, really exciting. I'll pass it back to Catherine.
Thank you, Eve. So today we're talking about decarbonising construction. We've got 3 speakers who will have through the most of the event today. Then we'll have a Q&A panel session for the last 40 minutes. So decarbonising construction, it's a very interesting topic. It's something which has been close to SEDA's heart for many years. We like to focus on using natural materials, but it's such a big subject that actually there's always many more things to learn. So what is important is that we share knowledge and collaborate, but also that we challenge ideas. Because many of the things which are present in construction now, which you would hear from people who are building new builds, they would say, oh, that's how it's always been. And it's not how it's always been. Quite often it's been down to a very good marketing campaign that happened 30 years ago or 20 years ago, and then that becomes established as the done thing. It's not necessarily the best thing, it's what people think is the right thing to do. So one of the things that SEDA would do is challenge that. So the presenters that we've got today have all got quite interesting views on specific things that we hope will challenge some of your thinking. So first of those, I'll introduce Tom Morton from ARC Architects, long-term SEDA member. Is one of the foremost authority of clay and earth building, but that's not what he's here to talk about tonight. So I'll pass you over to Tom.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you. Let's start with a film.
So I'm surrounded by something that actually represents the change that the construction sector has got to go through as we get to this zero carbon economy that we have to get to by mid-century. And this challenge of net zero is one that every sector of the economy is now running towards. But I would say the construction sector is not doing nearly enough. And of course, that is a huge problem. And if you look at the history in construction, it hasn't done enough. So that idea of change is really fundamental to what needs to happen over the course of the next few decades. And that idea that a younger generation in the construction sector, in the architecture sector, is really going to take us through this big change to use new materials, to really kind of grab the idea that construction and buildings and the built environment are absolutely critical to achieving net zero by mid-century.
I was really interested in this project as it's like with sustainability and with climate crisis, I'm interested in the ways that we understand where we are in a period of history.
I think with this it's very much take a step back, because we need to kind of relook at how we're interacting with the landscape and how we're controlling it and how we're managing it.
It's not just structures there and people come to see it, but something that they can participate in to grow.
Young architects will spend the bulk of their careers over the 30 years to 2050 responding to the impacts of the climate crisis. To do this successfully, they'll need new materials, new design strategies and new ways of working. Progress in construction is impeded by its insularity. Working with people who are different to us helps develop co-design skills and to communicate beyond the bubble of architecture. So we brought together a diverse group of young creatives from 17 disciplines in the 2 countries. In Scotland, students of architecture, product design engineering, jewellery, sculpture, photography, film and botany worked with early career architects, landscape architects and engineers. Connecting the creativities of the hand and the brain proved a powerful design tool.
I'm not from an architectural or an engineering background. I'm actually a jeweler and a silversmith. The move from object and sort of handheld scale to the scale of somewhere that you would step inside, you know, is a big jump, but the kind of interaction between a person and an object is kind of works in the same way, I guess.
The fundamental thing is, how do you make something work? The great joy of a project like this is it's fundamental kind of structural thinking. And I think here, this idea of using a grid shell to do it introduces a whole really interesting dynamic to the thing, because you can create structures that are unusual, but at the same time will stand.
I actually had sheets of this very thin plywood, so I cut that into strips, and I was trying to sort of look at the forms.
We chose a brownfield site, reusing foundations from a previous building that stored about 14 tonnes of carbon. The challenge was to design a new structure within the constraints of 4 lines of concrete. The response, a 3D curvilinear lattice, the most different form imaginable. This avoided new concrete, a huge carbon source and the second most used substance by man after water. 8% of global carbon emissions come from cement, more than from aviation. If concrete was a country, it would be the 3rd biggest carbon emitter after China and the USA. As transport transitions away from petrol and electricity from coal, so construction will transition away from cement. Along with biocomposite alternatives, future designers will need the skill to reuse the carbon held in existing structures. One set of foundations may support many buildings over their lifetime. Exploring low-carbon, non-toxic materials with transformative growth potential brought us to timber and mycelium. Larch was joined into 16-metre lengths, fixed with stainless steel cable ties and bolts.
Timber technology is really firing forward. You can make things that we couldn't do with bits of trees before, and that's completely fascinating.
Pushed to the limit of its strength and bendability, it wasn't clear whether the structure would work until the grid shell was actually constructed. If the timbers hadn't bent sufficiently, the group would have adapted the design on site to reflect the limitations of the material. This was an intentional design risk. Construction is dominated by accepted norms and low-risk approaches adopted for financial reasons, but which impede innovation and market development. To transform construction, we need to change our attitude to change. We need designers that will push materials and lead teams beyond their comfort zones. For this project, it was important that we were daring. Not to have risked failure would have guaranteed that we didn't succeed. The furniture created from mycelium and agro-waste in 5 days shows how we can grow our future buildings, displacing plastic and metal products. The group fused landscape and building architecture into one process of environmental design.
I was interested in how these sorts of interventions, like beavers introduce, help change a landscape and maybe slow down water.
We discovered that the post-farming landscape of the local area was part of the original Scottish rainforest, a rare temperate rainforest dominated by oak and hazel, rich in ferns, mosses and lichens. Using a generative approach, the timber grid shell mimics rainforest conditions of shade and shelter, enabling pioneer rainforest plants to develop as an educational resource and a nursery to spread the habitat further afield. By creating conditions that are good for forest plants, the design also makes a place for humans to thrive. Mimicking a forest clearing, the space slows people down, brings attention in close, moderates temperature, creates a more intimate acoustic, all reducing environmental stresses.
I quite like the idea that we can weave in elements of wildness and elements of rainforest. I've done some research looking at mosses and things like that as well, and plants that absorb water. Historically, our landscapes tended to be much better at absorbing water because of the way they were managed, and it'd be really nice to look at some of these plants.
We talk about landscape and then we talk about mycelium and then it's kind of the grid chart, and like obviously the success of this is all of it coming together, right?
The building is a temporary installation, but all buildings are temporary, though we rarely design with that in mind. Even the venue for COP26 is predicted to be below water soon. As our fixed infrastructure, buildings and coastal settlements struggle with increasing rainfall and rising sea levels, we need a more flexible and adaptive architecture for the coming century. And in this, our grid shell echoes the architecture of the Scottish Travellers, long-time residents of Argyll. Architecture is a creative industry whose mission is to build a better world, so it should be a leading voice in a progressive and just transition. But the tragedy at Grenfell revealed an industry dominated by short-term commercial interests rather than long-term social and environmental ones. This is in part because construction has an overwhelmingly patriarchal culture. It's the least gender-equal sector in the UK at 94% male, with 74% of architects men. So it stood out that when we called for creatives interested in working together to tackle climate change, applications were dominated by women at 83%. Research shows that women tend to be better managers and team workers and bring more diverse life experience to design. But the key reason we need a change of leadership from men to women in construction is because women are less vested in the established culture that inhibits progressive change. We found a generation of talented professional women committed to change who now need pathways to power along with the 17% of men. If we are to transform our profession to be fit for the 21st century, there is no doubt the future is female. Though challenged by COVID, the partnership with Ghana gave huge depth to our understanding of design for global climate change. While circumstances for the two countries were different, it became clear that the challenges of climate change and successful design strategies were the same. Both countries face a dangerous increase in rainfall linked to land use, and both solutions involve blended landscape building design and co-creation with communities. It was also clear that climate change exacerbates historic inequalities. The UK has 0.8% of the world human population, but is responsible for 5% of total cumulative emission. That's twice the population of Ghana, but 250 times its emissions. Scotland and Ghana are both Atlantic countries, but Scotland faces 43 centimetres of sea rise by 2100, while Ghana faces 78. Ghana also has fewer financial and human resources to mitigate the effects of climate change, in part the legacy of empire. The UK's wealth is the legacy of 250 years of coal, oil and gas emissions, the power and wealth that built an empire which grew by exploiting the natural and human resources of places like Ghana, whose resources were gold and slaves. By using a baseline for zero carbon strategies of 1990 level emissions, these historic global inequalities were perpetuated.
That central learning space, I think that's really, really important.
This engaging with the community and making sure that we're not just kind of coming in as artists and saying, this is what we think we need here. Children are involved in their future and kind of organising it. We have kind of the skeletal frame of what we're trying to do.
Our group of young designers may be responsible for constructing a few hundred buildings between now and 2050. Part of what we need to learn as designers and as a society is the skill of knowing how not to build, to live with less stuff, the art of living well by consuming less, so that there's more for others to share who have fewer resources. By making a space for learning, we learn many things. We learned that by recognising our place in nature, we can rediscover what it is to be human. We learned how biomaterials can help us grow our way to a zero carbon future. We learned that diversity brings strength. We learned how trying to achieve something new comes with the risk of failure, but we must still take that risk. And we learned how designers across the world share a common challenge, one that can only be solved together.
So there's 2 other films that we made around COP26, and the people that are here, there's a QR code on the cards we gave that give you a link to those other films, which are also, the links are on the website. Brilliant. So we're going to talk about decarbonising construction. And so construction, it's about 38% of carbon emissions in the UK, and for those that can see, that's a combination of buildings and manufacturing and construction. And about half of that is in the construction of stuff, and about half of that is in the use of it, energy in use. And as you can see that electricity and energy and transport are more than that, but electricity is going down in carbon emissions as we change to renewable systems, and transport is going to go down as that turns to electricity as well. And as that happens, the carbon emissions from buildings are going to become more significant. And in that trajectory, we're going to be reducing the carbon emissions within buildings. New buildings are going to need less energy in use, and we're going to retrofit existing buildings so that they use less energy in use as well. And what that's going to leave is the embodied carbon within the construction process. It's going to sit there as an increasingly obvious source and problem for carbon emissions. So what does that mean for us as individuals, as designers, as a sector? How can we influence that process of change so our industry damages the planet less, and that we transition in a more effective manner? And so I'm just going to look at one example of a material, and concrete. About 8% of global CO2 emissions come from cement. And within Scotland, the Dunbar Cement Works, so that's our 4th largest single source of carbon emissions after the petrochemical works at Grangemouth and Morton. And so individually, that's how much cement we individually consume each year, and that's how much CO2 comes out of that. So it's a pretty big problem, and it's going to become a bigger problem as other sources of carbon emissions are reduced. So what's our plan in our sector to cut embodied carbon? Basically, we don't have a plan. I'm sorry to say. And that's the problem, because a lot of other sectors do have a plan and our sector doesn't. But if we did have a plan, what would it look like? And it's really not rocket science. It would look like the plans for other sectors. So we would reduce demand, we would build less buildings, we would reuse buildings more, we would have leaner construction, and we would do that by using the tools of regulation and by public procurement strategies. And we would use alternative materials which are less damaging. And we know there's these are really materials that are grown rather than extracted and produced. So timber, mycelium, clay. The answers are pretty simple. We know they're there. We just need to get on and do it. So how is it all going to pan out? And I think the reality is we're way behind other sectors in this process of transition. And what that means is we're going to become more and more exposed to a process of change and less able to control that. And because at the moment, the government sees construction as a route to power the economy. So it's a vehicle for wealth and for jobs. It's not really a vehicle for transitioning to a low carbon society. And you can see this build thing is really just going to be at the root of very destructive processes. And what that means is, the construction industry will change. We will have to decarbonize, it's just going to be resisted by vested interests. And so it means that the process of change is going to be more abrupt and more painful. It's going to be much less efficient and more costly, both economically and in terms of jobs. And why is that? Because, you know, the construction sector and us individually, we're meant to be, you know, smart people involved in designing processes of change to make a better world, and we're just not doing that, which, you know, is frustrating. So, for example, in Scotland, we've got this commitment to build 110,000 new homes in the next 10 years, and that's, you know, that's to develop social justice and health and well-being and so on. But even the carbon-induced targets for that, these aren't zero carbon homes, these aren't passive houses, it's only silver standard. And there's no targets in terms of embodied carbon. So that's a route map to continuing the climate crisis, not to empowering change. And what it could be, you know, is a commitment by the government to net zero in use and net zero in production. And then it would actually, it would use the public sector procurement to drive a process of transformative change in the industry. But that's not what we're committed to at the moment. And the process of change in the industry, it's interesting because, you know, the producers of cement, these are massive, you know, global corporations, and they are, you know, subject to process of change. You can see that in other global industries of oil and transportation and energy and so on. You can use levers to affect them. We just aren't with construction materials. And so there is, according to Financial Times, a quest for green cement draws big name investors to the £300 billion industry. But so that investment is not being drawn because cement is green. It's being drawn because the projections are that the cement industry is going to double in value in the next 10 years, the period when we're going to be building those 110,000 homes. And, you know, if concrete is already the second biggest resource used by man after water and 8% of CO2 emissions, that's a really scary thing. And so you'll see, you know, in the magazines and on your feeds, you know, there's a lot of greenwash about these zero carbon cement solutions, which when you dig into them, don't really hold up scientifically. But what is interesting is what's happened in Sweden. The world's first carbon neutral cement plant going to be built there, and that relies then on carbon capture and storage. And the reality is in Scotland, we're not having carbon capture and storage because the government has stopped that program. So even that process of still producing the CO2 and not letting into the atmosphere is not working. And that's what these projections for the cement industry are based on. And in Sweden, the reason they are doing that is because the courts shut down their biggest cement factory, but they didn't do that because of CO2 emissions. They did that because of the impacts of mining. So it was to do with the extractive nature of the industry rather than its carbon emissions. And I think you can see that the influences on the construction industry may come from other legal routes rather than necessarily directly in terms of carbon emissions. It might be a more effective strategy for change. And of course, we know, I mean, all the alternatives are out there, they are being developed, but the amount of resources that are being developed, put into for research and development for biocomposite alternatives just is minuscule compared to other sectors' transition programs. And this is just a blatant flag out for one of our Interreg projects. If you go to this website, you can register for some training events we're having next year. So we need a just transition to zero carbon materials. No, actually, that's not really what we need, because the problem is much bigger than that. In construction, it's really a system problem of the culture of construction, of which carbon emissions is just one manifestation. I think construction consumes 60% of the natural resources used by man, 100 billion tons finite resources every year. And we produce about 60% in the UK, about 6% solid waste comes from construction. And that's 120 million tons a year, which for each one of you in the room, that's 2 million tons of waste going to landfill. And that is the extent to which our industry is producing waste. And that is just not something which we can sustain. So what we need actually is a just transformation to net zero carbon and net zero resource construction sector. We need to change the whole system of how we build things. It's not just about carbon. If we put built a passive house for everyone in Scotland, we'd have net zero carbon in use. Great, but by the time they got to go in and switch on their non-existent heating system, we'd have destroyed the planet in making those homes. So the whole process by which we create and manage the built realm needs to fundamentally change, and that's at the root of the word transformation. It's not a transition; it's really a transformation we need, so that we can, as architects, engineers, and surveyors, we can make our home on this planet without destroying it in the process. So what can I do? And when I say I mean us individually and collectively, because collective action here, I think, is really the key if we want to change the system. So, we have to change the culture. We have to stop giving prizes to big lumps of concrete and saying this is the thing we aspire to, especially when they're made on the big lump of demolished concrete for the building that's previously on the site and which only lasted one generation. This is not our vision for the future of architecture. And we need our organizations in the industry to stand up and take leadership. RIAS and RIBA. If the National Farmers Union can say, actually, we need to have fewer cows, then why can't RIAS and RIBA say, actually, we need to have fewer buildings and they just need to be better buildings? The time really, I don't understand why we're not saying these things. And we just individually, we need to reduce demand and use bioalternatives. You need to stop specifying and using concrete. It's really that simple. And yes, it's challenging and it's difficult, but by doing that, you will develop the skills and ability that we need in the future for our industry. Because our industry, we call it the construction industry, but really the reality is that we should call it the destruction industry, because that's the effect we're having on the planet. And as individuals and as professions, we're culpable in the destruction of the planet that we're making our home. And often, we earn money and we get turnover by producing stuff for the relatively wealthy part of the world, but it's at the expense of future generations and of the less wealthy parts. So let's retrain ourselves individually. Let's do it as a profession. Let's reskill the profession. Let's reskill those employed in the concrete industry. If they can do it in Aberdeen for the oil industry and reskill for renewables, why can't we do that in construction? And then maybe we'll start to realize some of the aspirations that were embodied in the project at Cove Park. Thank you very much. And now I'm going to introduce Felicity from ERZ Landscape Architects in Glasgow.
My name is Felicity Steers and I'm a director at Landscape Architects. We're a landscape practice in Glasgow. We do quite a lot of work with architects. In fact, we work with Tom sometimes, but we also do a lot of work without architects, and I think that's what I want to talk about today. Tom's talk was brilliant and was full of really terrifying facts and figures, and I can't actually offer you anything like that. I could talk about the things in our separate part of the building profession that cause problems, such as moving plants about Europe and introducing diseases into our ecosystems. But actually what I want to do is ask some other questions so that I come at this from a slightly different starting point, but I think having listened to Tom, it's quite a complementary view on things. So I was asked a slightly different question when I was invited to speak, and this was the question I was asked: how do we realign the construction industry to be able to deliver low carbon buildings? I don't deliver buildings, so it's not actually the right question for me to answer. So I was trying to think, what is the right question for me to answer here? And I thought, shall I ask this instead? How can landscape design support the decarbonisation of this construction industry? And actually, I thought, right, I'm speaking predominantly to a room full of architects, and I teach architects and work with architects, and I know that there is a huge misconception about what landscape architects do. So then I thought we have to ask, what is landscape design? Oh God, and then actually, before we can ask what is landscape design, we actually have to ask what is landscape, because we don't understand what landscape is, right? So Scotland has some of the best landscape in the world and also some of the worst. And particularly in our built environment, we have a real paucity of good landscape, and we do not work well with the resources that we have. So this is not landscape. This is an arguably megalomaniacal building on the edge of the Clyde. And landscape architects would refer to this style of frou-frou round the bottom as the parsley round the pig. And we call this the pig, right? And it's not on its own, and I'm afraid Foster's getting a bit of a kick in here, but you know, this is where COP's being held. Actually, I would call that one, which hasn't even got a garnish, a cake on a plate. And the problem is that we're surrounded by landscapes like this, and some of them are even worse. So here's the Celtic Park Stadium in the east end of the city, and I'll come back to this later. But I don't know how you would describe this. I spent 10 minutes trawling through images on the internet to come up with something funny, and I arrived with that. Not good enough, is it? I mean, really, we're on the edge of the Clyde. It's a river, for goodness sake. A river is a natural system, and we are building buildings like that with surroundings like that. And that is not architecture, and that is certainly not landscape architecture. So going back, what is landscape? Landscape is a complex network of human and natural, physical and psychological systems. It's not one thing, it's many, many things. And basically, landscape is the earth under our feet, the air we breathe, the stars above us, the oxygen, our food, our energy, and we ignore it at our absolute peril. And in architecture, many people that I work with ignore landscape or understand it to be the parsley round the pig. So I'm here on the soapbox, and I'm going to enjoy it. Those of you that know ERZ landscape architects will know that we worked with this building for over a decade, trying to bring it back to life. This is St. Peter's Seminary out in Cardross on the edge of Glasgow. Unfortunately for St. Peter's Seminary, although it is iconic and beautiful in many ways, the landscape is eating it. And that's because it was never built properly. It's got a flat roof, it's got tiny little gutters, and it's a travesty in terms of environmental design, and it couldn't survive. And many, many people have tried to rescue this building because there are wonderful things about it, but it's almost impossible to rescue. I don't know whether it will be rescued. We've lost the opportunity, but we tried for a very, very long time. At ERZ, we have been working for decades now with a sort of system of working called integrated green infrastructure, which some of you may know about. Integrated green infrastructure is looking at place as landscape and as a sort of complexity of all those different systems. So the world is made up of interconnected systems, and you can't actually work on one thing without working on everything else. And what I'm trying to say is that if you're going to design a building, you have to look at it within the context of the landscape. And this is quite a nice analogy that we use for trying to describe what we do in the office. So any organism is a system and a network of different and layered things going on. And like an ecosystem, like the whole planet and also like a human body. So what we use the analogy of the human body to describe integrated green infrastructure. So integrated green infrastructure looks at habitat networks, it looks at access networks, it looks at green and open space, it looks at water management, which in Scotland is a huge issue, roads and transport and how we move about, and built development. And what you can see is that the construction industry is probably primarily concerned with roads, transport and built development. In fact, that's not that big part of the whole system. And if you were to use the analogy of surgery, and you were a surgeon and you were going to perform heart surgery, or to use this, well, let's use the skeleton analogy. So roads and transport, you're going to do major surgery on part of your skeleton. You wouldn't, no surgeon would do that without looking at whether your heart's working or your lungs are working or your veins are working, because the surgery would fail. And in fact, that's what we're doing over and over again. We're performing surgery by building buildings without, you know, taking into consideration the bigger systems. So this is a horrible slide that I've nicked from a different presentation, but it does sort of explain it. It's a bit cluttered. You can tell I like empty slides. But this layer cake approach to site analysis is something that we use quite a lot, and it goes back to Ian McCarg, who was a Glaswegian landscape architect in the 20th century, who was massively influential in looking at landscape analysis and the relationship between design and nature. And by putting these layers in place, we're able to analyze the different systems and look at how they interact with each other. So this is a sort of site analysis that we always do. And we look at water, we look at hydrology, topology, topography, green networks, habitat, and we use all of those tools to create places which are landscapes in which buildings may or may not sit. So let's turn the question on its head. This is a diagrammatic place where you've got active travel networks, you've got footpaths, you've got links beyond into the wider city, you've got water flowing through not only the landscape but through the buildings of green roofs, through rainwater harvesting, you've got green habitat networks coming through the buildings, through the green roofs, maybe through green walls, courtyards. You've got permeable paving outside the buildings that lets the water go back into the land instead of being taken into sewage systems. And you start to create places that are part of the bigger, wider landscape networks instead of places that stop them and halt those processes and networks in their tracks and create barriers and blockages. So the question becomes then, how can buildings support landscape? And that's what I think the sea change needs to be if we're going to realign the Scottish construction industry towards decarbonisation. You've got to change the starting point and look at landscape as the root of all of it. I'm just going to show you a few projects from the office which are in different stages of work. At the moment, my colleague Rolf, who's the other director in the company, is working with West of Scotland Housing Association in Merry Hill North. And this is a completely different type of master plan because it starts with the landscape and the buildings will come later. So we're developing a master plan at quite a large scale, which puts in place habitat networks, forest cover, productive woodlands. It starts by looking at the natural topography and geomorphology of the place. It then manipulates water, uses the existing hydrology to create natural drainage through the site. It looks at active travel and how it connects to existing routes and movements and train lines and footpaths. All the buildings are ghosted in, but they're ghosted in to determine that they are going to have good microclimate, that they're going to have, everybody's got some south facing light. So the buildings come last and not first. And this is this is a landscape-led design process, and I think that the places that are going to result from this where people live will also be much better for people as well as better for, you know, it's a rejuvenation project as well. So it is definitely better for the landscape. A lot of this is empty, derelict and vacant land. So on that note, extra slide, the visualization there. So the buildings are just ghosts. They will come in to support this landscape later when that aspect of the development starts, and all of this will be put in place first. Coming back to Celtic Park, can this landscape-led process be used as a kind of cure for the malaise that we were talking about earlier? And yes, it can. In this part of the city, in the East End, we were commissioned quite a long time ago in 2013 as part of the Commonwealth Games legacy projects to look at an integrated green infrastructure strategy for that part of town. And as part of that bigger network strategy, we identified a series of sites for development. And one of them was this abandoned bus park outside of Celtic Park, which was highly contaminated and not really used for anything. And Camlaki Park, which is the result of the first phase of implementation of the Green Network Strategy, is an ecological park. It deals with the contamination of the land. It deals with problems with flooding, localized flooding problems and water management. It brings in a whole lot of native plants and tree cover. And perhaps from a human perspective, most importantly, it's got facilities in it for people who were living in extremely isolated, you know, in terms of climate equity or social equity or health equity, the people living in and around what was that bus park were extremely limited in what they were able to access. So it changes the neighborhood, and it has also enabled more housing to be built, which is of much, much better quality. And I take on board, Tom, what you're saying about how we shouldn't be building houses. But in this part of Glasgow, the housing stock was so incredibly poor. And we now, we also master planned the housing, and the housing is full of rain gardens, it's got green roofs, it's not passive house, but it's of a much, much higher ecological quality than what was being lived in before. And it's designed for conviviality with a lot of social space. And the park, the integrated green strategy enabled the park has enabled the housing. So this is what happens when landscape comes first and not last. I'm working with the National Health Service looking at the Queen Elizabeth Hospital campus, which is an absolutely horrendous place that adds enormously to stress if you are having to go into hospital. A friend of mine got admitted with COVID and couldn't even find the door and had to be rescued. I mean, it's really, really bad. It's built next to the sewage works. So when the wind's in the right direction, the whole place stinks, and it's very, very windy because this building and this building, these two buildings form a wind tunnel with the southwest wind blowing between them. The main entrance to the new hospital faces north, so it's north facing and very, very windy, which in Scotland is not good news. So we've been working with the sustainability team for Greater Glasgow and Clyde, and we've been looking, and we've been doing enormous amounts of this layered analysis, trying to work out how the landscape worked before, how we can use those systems to mitigate what's been built, and how we can add things to make these buildings work much, much harder in terms of serving the landscape. And we've done that at a range of scales, from citywide to local round govern to down onto the campus itself. And the overall concept now is looking at the campus as a landscape system, which is sort of structured around water. There's a suds tank in the middle of the hospital at the moment, which is literally a hole in front of the main doorway, opening that up into a park. But that enables us to put green drainage into the car parks, and the car parks will become filtration systems for all the groundwater. We'll be taking water off the buildings. We're going to plant wet woodlands all the way through the car parks to deal with the runoff from the car parks and the oil that's going into the ground. And all of this hopefully will greatly influence the plans for new buildings at the hospital, of which there are plans for many, by demonstrating the power of the outside as well as the healing environment. Because if we get people outside, the statistical evidence for the speed at which people heal is remarkable. So even if you can see a tree outside your window, you get better more quickly. These things seem small, but they're big. You know, they're big, powerful tools for change. If you can demonstrate that, then that's saving the health service millions of pounds of money, and then they start to listen to you. So the Suds Pond, which is a big engineered tank, becomes a park. I'm just working on designing this up at the moment. With no concrete, because we're as guilty as that as the architects. We've been using concrete for years. So how do we realign the construction industry to be able to deliver low carbon buildings? Everything that he said, plus we need to be looking at the much bigger context of the landscapes in which we live. And in order to do that, what we're looking at is being a positive continuum. So even the smallest building, but especially large groups of buildings, should be a positive continuum within the surrounding systems. You need to link to services, you need to link to active travel and other buildings and destinations. You need to be looking at the water and the ground and the soil and the ecology, the microclimate, the biodiversity, and also people and healthy lives, and getting people outside and aiding conviviality. And that's a really big thing. So this is what I think. You've got to remove all the red lines. You've got to remove red lines around planning applications and around site analysis. You've got to be looking much, much more widely when you plan buildings. And this is the landscape-led approach. We also need to remove all red lines between professions. So I'm really echoing quite a lot of what Tom said, but no siloing, right? So don't put us in the box where we do the passing around the pig, because we can bring a lot to the table, as can the ecologists, as can some engineers. Architecture as a profession is sometimes, I actually had dinner with somebody whose name I won't mention, who told me that architects were the conductors of the orchestra and the other people were merely the players. Join the band, guys, because it's much more fun and much more productive and much more modern. So no siloing of professions and cross-disciplinary education. I've worked in education a long time. We silo from the very beginning, and I think education is where we need to start, and we need to start having courses, and Catherine would agree with this, who joined you at Cove Park from our office. We need courses where you're not a landscape architect or an architect. We need built environment courses that look at the much bigger picture and then allow people to specialise. So I'd say 2 years of general training before you decide what you want to be. So no pigs, systems, that's me.
We can now introduce Peter. Peter, who has extensive experience as a practicing architect, as an educator, and as a researcher and general protagonist for the built environment.
Okay, let's start now. I was given the title. I realized after a while I could probably put about half a dozen different presentations together to cover the subject, because there's such a lot of material to think about. I'll start with this slide. This is a project I was involved in 3 years ago. It's all cross-laminated timber. It's hardwood cross-laminated timber. It's the first hardwood cross-laminated timber building anywhere. We made it in Scotland, and we made it in various ways because I got involved with the American Hardwood Export Council. They wanted to do something. They do something at the London Design Festival every year, and interesting demonstration projects. And I'll come back to demonstration projects. But they wanted to get somewhere where they could make it in this country, because all the things they'd done previously were made in Germany. They'd had to stop companies interrupting the production processes. Companies wanted to keep the IP, everything else. And I said, no, we can do it. We'll do it we'll make everything open access and so on. So this was designed by Walters and architects and Arabs. We brought the timber over from America. Okay, that sounds terrible, you know, and transportation, but this is tulip wood. Tulip wood grows all the way down the Appalachians. It grows like a weed. The regrowth of it is amazingly fast, and the industry there, by and large, uses it for firewood or some furniture making or veneers for plywood. It's all kind of low value kind of stuff. And the objective here was to say, how do we raise the value of the timber to help the forestry sector and the manufacturing sector in that part of the world? So though we made it here, it's actually been to Milan and Madrid and other places since and go back to America. So it's just a starting point here, because what I wanted to get onto was say, you know, we need to do things, and I've called this the mass timber revolution. A lot of my work at the moment is in mass timber. We set up a mass timber academy to teach architects and engineers about mass timber, because although people are kind of familiar with it, we've got so many buildings in this country, there's a lot of interest in doing it. So let me just see if I can push this forward. There. So why a revolution? Why do we call it a revolution? Because we need to change. We need to change. The whole industry is dying on its feet in many ways. It doesn't look like it, but if I go to another slide here, there are reasons to change. Obviously, COP26 is happening. So a very, you know, put this in, this with material coming out, there's information coming out, all sorts of things, but it's just a catalyst to say, it's a moment when we can make decisions, we can do things if we've got the will and the determination to do it. And why? I don't know if any of you, how many of you are architects or students? Right, so you've got the Mark Farmer's report came out end of 2016, and he did this devastating report about the construction industry in the UK. You could anticipate Brexit, you could say lots of the labour force is going to disappear, all the skills are going to disappear, we're not training people, we're doing all sorts of the wrong things with materials and methods of construction and so on. If we don't modernise, we have 10 years before the industry collapses. Now, he brought out a report just the end of, earlier this year, and said, we don't actually have 10 years anymore. It's really going badly, right? So that's why we need to kind of think in a different way. And Buckminster Fuller, if you've come across him at all, who did geodesic domes and all sorts of things, but he had this incredible quote which said, you know, if we're going to change things, we can't just tinker around the edges. We can't say, oh, isn't it nice? Let's change the contractual structure, the procurement structure, all these kind of things. Forget it. We need radical change. Otherwise, nothing's going to happen. And nothing's going to happen in terms of decarbonising if we don't. So making change happen. Why do we want to do that? Obviously, there are things, the climate emergency, all the government's net zero carbon. The term net zero is just so awful. We want zero. Net zero is just rubbish, right? So let's not beat about the bush here. The circular economy, that's where we want to get to. The construction industry pays lip service to it, but we really need to get there, because with timber buildings, and that's the world I work in, and I've worked in for over 20 years, there are health benefits. Exposed timber, unlike the plasterboard here, have health benefits. You have timber is hygroscopic. The moisture layer absorbs, releases, so on. You get good air quality, and so on. One of the things I've come on to here is about how do we use homegrown resources. Okay, I said American timber. All my work for the last, certainly nearly 20 years, has been in looking at how do we get homegrown timber, UK grown timber, Scottish grown timber into better production and better value, so we can replant, do more things. And so it's how do we stimulate manufacture? Because one of the things Tom mentioned it about manufacture, we actually don't manufacture anything. That's one of the problems in this country. We import everything. We import 80% of our construction timber. I mean, that's just mad. And particularly at the moment, post-Brexit, the prices of timber and other materials have rocketed. And so building costs rocket, et cetera, et cetera. So looking at our own resource and saying, how do we use our own resource better as part of the deal? You know, how do we do this? And there are lots of benefits of mass timber. So I don't want to give you a lecture about that, because that's a whole course we run. And it takes quite a long time to talk about all the different parts of it. But you can see them all there. Ping, ping, ping. You know, lots of interesting issues there. And there's even more things, even more points. In fact, I've got a list of about 50 points about why this is a good way forward. But that's probably going to turn into a book rather than a few slides. But we've been using solid laminate timber systems for hundreds of years. This is a bridge, if you can see, Dagestan is solid timber laid on board, strips of wood going through to lock the timber together, keep it all in place, allow it to move as well without glues and so on, so that you can actually, in parts of the world where there are seismic conditions and so on, you have that kind of elasticity in the structure, a bit of flexibility, so it doesn't fall down, and it hasn't fallen down, right? So, and that's really part of what I'm looking at in terms of decarbonisation. So, those of you who have heard of CLT, anybody? Mostly? When was it first used in the UK? 1998, 99. This is Shrewsbury Music School. And we've been using this for more than 20 years. And I get phone calls regularly saying, well, this is material, this is kind of risky. And you think, we've been using it for over 20 years. There are about 1,500 CLT buildings in this country. And I still get those questions, phone calls all the time from engineers, worse QSs, and a lot of architects who, to be fair, think it's like building a big cardboard building. And it's not, right? It's actually quite a lot to it. However, there's when first started. If we didn't have this Zoom thing at the top, you'd see it says 1923 patent for cross-laminated timber in the United States, right? So things that we all think are new aren't that new, right? And they're not that complicated either, because that could be as easily non-glued as glued. A lot of the work I've been doing for some time has been about down-laminated systems, so that we can actually put things together, cross-laminated systems without glue, because then we can do things more locally around the country, with local forests, local manufacture, get out of the whole embodied carbon issue in a big way. And there we go, because in here, these are the countries that we import from, right, into the UK. We import solid laminate timber systems, I'll call them, Rulam, LVL, CLT, and so on. And what we've been doing, 2006, I was part of a joint venture. I was invited to work on a joint venture thing with an Austrian company to do things with Scottish timber. 15 years later, we're kind of getting close to it. Because, and it's really, we're getting close to it because an Austrian firm has now taken over our biggest sawmills in Britain, and they're going to make CLT in this country, right, from UK timber. But it's taken a long time. It's been a very frustrating experience, I have to say, but there we go. And partly it's because they make the Central Europe, Austria, Switzerland, Germany, they have massive amounts of land cover of forest, right? So Austria particularly, there's all the big manufacturers are there. Now but they don't get all the timber from Austria. They can bring it in from countries nearby, Romania, so on, other places where there's really poor communities with poor infrastructure and so on. They sell their timber cheap to Austria. They turn it into big piles and they sell it to us for lots of money, right? So there's a need to look at how do we do this on a much wider basis than just looking at ourselves. It's really about how do we think differently about the forest resources we have? How do we use them better? How do we move them and use them more in an environmentally friendly way? And when we come on to urban design, you start to see around the world at the moment that everywhere except Britain, is pushing to build more timber buildings. They're changing the legislation across the states, state by state by state. They're changing their building codes to promote greater use of timber, particularly for tall timber buildings. Last week or 2 weeks ago, New York changed its building codes. The hardest city in the world to build with timber has changed its building codes to promote the use of cross-laminated timber there. And that's a massive change in the city. It's absolutely devoted to concrete and steel. There are things going on, and it's partly because society around the world is gravitating towards cities, and land costs become very expensive. Buildings have to go upwards on available bits of land. And traditionally, they've gone upwards with steel and concrete and so on. I did a project some years ago with OM, big firm in Chicago, where they were doing research about a project they did in 1964, a 46-story building, steel, concrete, glass. Could they do it in wood? And they did a fantastic research project to realize, yes, they could do it in wood, but they actually needed to make all the connections in concrete just to weigh the building down in a windy city. But the bulk of it could be wood. This is actually a project that's mooted in Oslo. And so I think it's about 24 stories. And this is one that's just been finished in Skellefteå in the north of Sweden, which is 18 stories. And it's all timber, and it's all local timber. They've made everything within 20 miles through it, basically. And it's a massive complex. It's a hotel, it's a tower, but it sits on an extraordinary truss frame over auditoriums and things like this. And the other thing that we don't do in this country is we don't teach in our schools of architecture and engineering anything about wood, right? We don't do it. We talk about it, and if we're going to decarbonize, we need to do more than talk about it. We need to make it happen. You know, and so a lot of what I do is filling a gap because the universities don't do it, and the engineering schools definitely don't do it. They don't want to do it because they're all trained in steel and concrete. That's what they know. These are predictable things. Timber's not so predictable. And, you know, every tree is different, et cetera, et cetera. This is kind of research. The research that's going on in other places is extraordinary. This is cross-laminated timber, right? And it's cross-laminated timber like you've never seen it because they've analysed the fact that trees, and certainly trees in Scotland, thickness grow spirally. And within that, when you cut them down, put them through a sawmill, the outside boards are the stiffest, strongest, straightest bits. The centre of the tree, the heartwood, is the bit that when you put it in the kiln and you dry it too fast, kind of twists. It just follows the what they call the internal cellular structure. It allows the thing to twist. So what these guys in Stuttgart is say, let's control that twist and then let's make solid panels. Now, why do you want to make solid panels out of it? Because ordinary pieces of wood shrink, they move, they do different things. When you make a panel, you compress out of it the distortion. You make a dimensionally stable piece of material for construction, but you also lock in humongous amounts of atmospheric carbon dioxide into solid panels, right? And that's part of the reason we want to do it rather than using concrete. And then, of course, we have the elephant in the room. Grenfell Tower caused everything to go backwards in the UK. The legislation that came in England and Wales said, oh, anything above 18 meters in the wall structure can't be combustible. Now, that kind of shows the total ignorance of politicians to know that they think they can build a building without anything in it that's combustible. But it meant that although Grenfell Tower was all concrete, the one material that was most affected by the change of legislation was wood, because we're building in London, certainly, huge numbers of tall residential buildings, solid timber panels. That was the structure. And because in England and Wales, they say the structure of the wall completely is kind of outlawed above the height of one of the people in this room. You know, it's you can't do it. In Scotland, it's slightly different because we've built with platform timber frame for 50 years. So it's a kind of normal mode of building housing here. And so the regulations here are to do with the cladding, not the wall structure. But so I'm coming on to, I'm just racing through all this. That's a building in London. It's done by Walkerston Architects. It's 10 stories, Dawson Lane, with 150 flats, all timber. And of course, it's in London. When you go there and look at it now, it's all clad in brick. And so solid construction, structural of the whole building, the structure of the whole building is timber. Then they have to put on these metal angle brackets to hold a thin plane of brick all around it. And you think, why do we need to do this? You know, it's just, it's tradition. It's kind of like everybody feels more comfortable with it. But actually, we need to change and think about building differently. So what do we do here? Oh, I can't actually see that now. I think I've said here, there's two things that I want to do and two things we're working on. One is to say, let's have a timber innovation act and let's deal with architecture. Because I brought some things here. I said, and way back in about 1999, when the Scottish Parliament was first operating, I did a lot of lobbying and lots of articles, organised conferences, different things, to get an architecture policy for Scotland. I looked at the Netherlands, I looked at Norway, I looked at Finland, places that had sensible architecture policies to transform construction. So what we did all around the country, we had lots of meetings with architects, other people, planners, different things. And we had about, from all these consultations, we had a document that was about 200 pages of ideas. It was brilliant. And then the civil servants, the architects in Victoria Quay and Edinburgh, the Scottish executive as it was then, came out with this 16 pages of motherhood and apple pie, no deliverables, right? Right, throw that away. The next thing they did was they did a report on no deliverables in 2005. Then they came out with another thing that said a policy in architecture. Then it was policy on architecture and placemaking. And then it was a policy statement on architecture and place for Scotland. So the policy was just in the bin, right? And so we don't have really a policy. We're the first place in Britain to have a policy, but they couldn't kind of get their head around it because it meant confronting the construction industry. And the construction industry is wedded, as you know, to really primitive ways. And they like the primitive ways because they can put things into contracts where they can then make lots of claims for extra money, having priced the job so low it's not worth doing, right? So we need to change all of these things. And so from my point of view, because I've done lots of work in architecture policy, but the thing that really struck me a few years ago was in the United States, Obama, when he was president, when they had a president, he introduced a thing to say, we'll have an architecture competition for tall buildings, tall timber buildings, right? So he put up $1 million as an architectural prize. Wow, right? And when it came to the bit, the judges decided there was 2 projects that they thought were really good. Obama said, give them both $1 million. Let's get one built in the west, one built in the east. Now, actually, those 2 buildings aren't built now, but what it did stimulate was a Tall Timber Act going through the Senate. And that began to push things in around the country to really promote the forest industry, their processing industry, their manufacturing sector. Whereas now there are factories all over the United States producing solid laminate timber systems from locally grown timber by and large. But they're also building tons of buildings. At the moment, there's about 125 tall timber buildings, either in construction or about to go into construction across the United States. And that's true in Canada as well. In France, the policy from the government, from Macron, has been to say, from now on, every public building has to be at least 50% bio-based materials, mainly timber, obviously, but other things possible, hemp, etc. The Paris Olympics are intended to be mostly all timber buildings. So that's France. Netherlands, in the last few weeks, they've got 32 local authorities already all committed to doing all the buildings in timber from now on, right? So when we're talking about decarbonising, say we've got one renewable material available to, okay, we've got bamboo as well, but we don't really grow much bamboo, we feed it to pandas. And so we need to do things slightly differently. And we do have a resource. Now, there's a lot of discussion and argument about the resource we have, but in Scotland, we have about 18% of our land mass is forest, and a great deal of that is production forestry, because it was planted after the First World War to replace the timber that had been cut down for trench linings and pit props. When the Forestry Commission was created, it was to plant timber. It wasn't to do with thinking about what to do with the timber when it matured. And so in about the year 2000, there was this sense of all of this timber was coming to maturity. We had what was called this wall of wood that was going to emerge. What do we do with it? And I was working at Edinburgh Napier University at the time. We had a Centre for Timber Engineering, and we got lots of money from the Scottish Executive to send people like yourselves out into forests to categorise everything, because we knew nothing about the quality, the properties of the timber that was being grown in Scotland. Insane, you might think, but that was the state of the art then, right? So very shortly afterwards, we concentrated on certain species, mainly Sitka, larch, Scots pine, Douglas fir, and some other kind of wild cards, if you like, hemlock and moss and cypress. But the point being that very soon we had all we needed to know about Sitka. We knew how it grew in the height of the hillside, the wind direction, the soil conditions, the spacing between trees, all of this, and the fact that we knew wherever it was, whether it was Northern Ireland, north of England, Scotland, it was a variable material. And so the obvious thing to do was to say, how do we make better use of a variable material? And moving towards laminated timber methods was really part of that. And that's what I've been involved in, I suppose, for a very long time now. And we're getting closer to it. And but the thing I was saying about in America with Obama, what that did, the Tall Timber Act came in, and then there was this idea of the Timber Innovation Act. But Obama was kicked into touch, and another guy came in, and he wasn't interested in anything to do with the natural environment whatsoever, right? And but they now do have a Timber Innovation Act because it got hidden by the Agriculture Department in an agriculture bill, and he signed it all off. So there is a Timber Innovation Act there, and when you look at that, you realise there are things within it about money for grants, for research, for education, for a whole range of things. There's assistance for supporting innovative ideas about timber in buildings. There's incentivizing things to actually look at existing buildings. How do we do more things cleverly? I'm working on other projects that have to do with that in Scotland in terms of ruins that we have. How do we get them, repurpose them and regenerate them? I'm trying to see this. And then we come on to architecture policy, right? So I'll move to, I think, possibly one of the last slides. As I say, I've been trying to kind of race through this. So what I'm interested in and what I would like to engage you all in is say, we need a Timber Innovation Act. We need an architecture policy with teeth, i.e. deliverables, KPIs that say, this is what we're going to do and by when, right? Stop the pissing around. Let's just make things happen. As a profession, we have incredibly weak professional institutions. They're lost somewhere in the 19th century, and we need to do it ourselves, right? So we need to think about how do we make these things happen? And that's about collective lobbying power. Because my interest is saying we need to close the loop between the forestry. When we cut down trees, we process them in sawmills. We don't yet do enough manufacture of high value manufacture, but we do need to do the research and development that takes us there in order to take things into construction that we make here and we can take locally to things, and that we can work between the design community, the landscape community, the architects, the engineers, to understand better the things that we can make here and build with. And then we can create an architecture that's perhaps more specific to the ecology of the country, the culture of the country, the environment. But because we need that to affect housing policy, because the slide up earlier about 100,000 affordable houses is just nonsense. They're never going to build it, because we ask the volume house builders to do some affordable houses in the schemes that they build. And the thing that usually gets dropped is, well, the landscaping usually gets dropped, but the affordable housing also just disappears. And so there's always this kind of ever receding target, you know, where we need to do this, but we don't actually do much of it. And the volume house builders are never going to do it, because if they built all the houses that the government wanted, the UK government wants 300,000 houses a year, the industry builds about 100,000, 120,000. They're never going to build more, because that would depress the prices and their profit margins. So let's not mess around and think that they're genuine philanthropic guys building some affordable housing. They're not going to do that. So we need to think about, how do we do it more locally? How do we do it manufacturing locally, creating jobs, skills, long-term support for communities? And so part of this is we need to look at the 19 higher education institutes in Scotland and say, stop the nonsense. Felicity referred to the fact we don't have cross-disciplinary things. We have silos, we have different departments. As an architecture student, how many times do you meet students from other departments, from law or anything else? You don't, right? If you go to the City of Glasgow College, different ballgame. That's the new future. You go in there, all of the departments are all intermingled in one enormous building. Actually, it's a bit of a shocker, because I went to school and I was there before. But it's amazing when you go in there and you realize there's no hierarchies. There's just lots of little cafe areas. Students meet, they mingle. If you're a hairdresser or a joiner, you meet. It's not like being in an architecture school and being hermetically sealed from the world. You know, we need to rethink the way we do higher education, because it's in the past in terms of the kind of courses we run in architecture and in engineering. So there's a lot of things we can do, but we need to do it ourselves. We need to make that demand. The same way when I came in today, you know, huge crowds of people wanting things to happen, wanting things to change. But we need to actually mobilize to do it and say, let's write the courses, let's do the things that need to be done, not wait for it to happen, because it's not going to happen if you leave it to other people. So I think that's me. So it's a discussion. You can say, well, that was kind of moderately interesting when it gets forgotten, or we can talk about it and say, how do we make things happen? How do we do it? How do we make it happen? So that's it. The path's the way forward. It's up to you. Thank you.
Can I get all the presenters up to the front, please? We've also got another speaker, or another guest coming up to help in the panel, Ruth Crew, who's unfortunately given the poison chalice, have been able to speak on behalf of structural engineers. So we're not going to criticise what structural engineers do. They're part of the solution, not part of the problem. Okay. The Q&A session that we have here is going to be a mix of Questions from the audience plus questions from our online team. We're going to have a little bit of a disembodied voice. We're monitoring this from somebody who's outside of the room. So I've asked Lo if she can be collating any questions that are coming in, and we're going to try and get her to ask her questions through our speakers here. But we'll start with one from the floor, I think, to get everybody started. So,
Glo here. Peter was asking about the, given the urgency of the change required, or transformation, as Tom put it, we know the answers, at least some of them. Does the industry need to choose 5 key actions for government to instigate so that we can all get behind these and lobby collectively? Because at the present, we seem to be too diverse and have too many bodies running around with their own initiatives, good as they are, might not be as effective. So
okay. We'll hand the microphone back to Peter.
The premise of the question was, can we come up with 5 actions to ask the government to do something? And when did that ever work? You know, it's a different thing. I think Felicity said it, we need to work together as professions. We need to have collective action. If you look at the concrete industry, you look at the steel industry, they have one body that really puts lots of money into things. If you go to an engineering department, beginning of an academic year, tons of material from the concrete and steel industries for students. You don't get it from the timber industry because it's fragmented, right? And we need to look at the professional bodies, but look at the industry as well and say, how do we change things? And not wait for the government to take action, because that takes forever. You know, they find all sorts of ways of delaying things because they've got vested interests. They've got people, you know, basically funding them. So we need to actually say, how do we fund ourselves and how do we make change happen? And, you know, I get very impatient, as you probably realized. But you know, you watch these things over the years and things come and go, and then you get distracted. It's a sort of divide and rule thing. People come up with ideas that are really quite small and quite never going to go anywhere. And people spend lots of time discussing them and debating them. And you think, let's just focus in on the key points. I've made key points here to say there's a couple of things we can do to demand from government some legislation that allows us to actually move forward.
I mean, Peter's question was can the industry come together and do that? I think the reality is the nature of our industry is one that inhibits change rather than drives it, and it's perhaps a characteristic in the UK that it has a very centralised and a very top-down construction industry and built down generally. And I think one of the core problems we have is that it is it's very remote from the impacts it has, and the people that experience the built environment, you know, you and me, have very little control over those processes and decisions and investment. And at the moment, the industry is resisting change and worried about carbon taxation. We're not going to have carbon taxation, and you know, you can see there'll be a resistance against embodied carbon being brought into regulations and actually counted. We're not even counting the carbon at the moment. How can you set a target when you're not even counting it? And so I think, but you can look to how other sectors have changed, and in a way focusing on simple things like, you know, with cars, we're stopping producing petrol and diesel cars by 2030. So why can't we stop, you know, using concrete, or at least 50% reduction by 2030? Let's have a simple target and lobby to achieve that. But I think that lobbying is not going to come from industry. It needs to come from the professions and from the public, and we need to find that voice of leadership. So those voices, I think, come from the fringe. They don't come from the centre.
I'd just make one other quick comment about this. Many years ago, I brought people over from Norway for a conference and so on. I brought the guy who was the director of the Norwegian Design Centre. And he said that in 1994, when they did the Winter Olympics in Lillehammer, they also started a thing called the National Tourist Routes. And we subsequently did projects in Scotland about that. But he said to me, in order to establish design and architecture in people's minds, it wasn't enough just to build buildings. We needed to create an enemy, he said. And so they decided to tackle the oil industry. And the way they did it was to put out a survey to the public. They did, are you satisfied with the design of petrol stations around the country? And they got 80% of people saying, no, they're rubbish, right? So they did then 3 ideas for urban, suburban and rural petrol stations. They did some designs for it. And the minister said to the industry, to the oil industry, right, this is what you want me to do. And they said, no, we don't want to do that. She said, well, we won't give you any sites. And that was it. It changed, right? And that's the kind of radical action we need to kind of think about, being much more creative about it.
I think a couple of things that the government could do if the agenda would be to make embodied carbon calculating mandatory, like make it a mandatory requirement that has to go along with planning applications. Hold structural engineers accountable for what they're putting in their designs. And it could be perhaps audited by a third party as well to make sure that it's accurate. Also, I think that perhaps the government could more heavily tax cement, because it just seems to be extremely cheap. Like, I don't know, so I'm not a quantity surveyor, but I've seen on construction sites like enormous stockpiles of cement that have actually gone out of date and just had to be sent to landfill because they were just stockpiled for too long, and then it wasn't usable. And I've had contractors approach me all the time saying, oh, we really want to put this cement in, like this grade of concrete in, which has got like a high cement content, because it'll allow us to progress the work faster. So there's clearly not a big enough kind of cost incentive for them to avoid using high cement concrete. Is there any questions to that? Oh, good. We've got a couple of hands going up. I'll ask the gentleman over there, and I'll repeat the question once you've said it. So the thing that seems to be hampering a wider take-up of timber construction is that the insurance industry see it as a perceived risk, and as a result, if you put forward that timber construction, then to minimise the risks, it's often changed back to what we'd regard as a traditional construction. So how can we change this? I'm going to jump in and say one thing before Peter jumps in and say this, because I know he'll have a long answer to this. I remember during my career for this, there was a large-scale fire engineering exercise was carried out on timber frame constructions, a 5-storey building that was built in Carrington. They set it fire just to see what would happen. And that actually significantly changed the uptake of the use of timber frame that we now use for our housing. And it was because they actually just tested it and said, well, we don't know, let's try, let's see what happens. So that maybe there's a potential there that if we want to promote new constructions using cross-laminate timber, for instance, then we should test it, see what the results are, and then there's no guessing. We know what's going to happen. But I'll pass on to Peter. I'm sure he'll have a lot to say about it.
I don't need to have a lot to say. There's a lot happening on this front. I mean, particularly post-Grenfell. But you've got to distinguish between construction insurance, property insurance, end user insurance, and so on. And I think we get kind of a bit confused by it because, and I've talked to insurers about it, but insurers in this country generally are about 20 years behind the curve in terms of building technology. And so they look for avoiding risk, and that's fair. Because they've been losing a lot of money on a lot of projects, not timber ones, but a lot of other things. So yesterday in our course, we had Andrew Walk talking about something he's been working on with people in insurance, in house NHBC, developers, a whole range of people around the table to look at what they've done now is create what they call a new model building, where you can build a timber structure but separate the cladding from it, because the cladding was the problem at Grenfell, not the building itself, right? And we've managed to, the government is a good example of the government skirting around the problem of the cladding. The people who live in buildings that still have it can't get insurance, they can't sell their houses, anything else. You know, it's something needs to be done. But the point, and also in 3-4 weeks' time, and we have people, an underwriter from the insurance industry who deals with all the insurance companies talking about what they're doing and what they're trying to do, because they realize that the world's moving, and it's not just insurance in this country. It's changing. The whole insurance scene is changing in other places in America and different things to accommodate what modern timber technologies are able to do.
Good question. I'll just repeat that for the online audience. So if we're going to need 400,000 new houses a year and we're going to build them all out of timber, where's the timber coming from compared to what we've got already, and how much will we need to plant to keep that going? Yes, we'll let Felicity answer there.
Forestry production, whilst necessary, is a monoculture. It's very, very poor for the environment. It doesn't sustain a broad range of flora and fauna. So whilst it's a crop, right, it's not natural. So timber is not entirely the answer. We need to be exploring our landscapes a bit more sophisticatedly. So we've been planting monocrops of timber, and it's not in itself sustainable. So I think you've got to go back to what Tom was talking about, which is reducing the amount of building. And we talk about reducing the amount of, nobody's talking about using less energy. And I've just come from the climate march. I've been listening to people shouting about capitalism, and I'm sorry, it does come back to capitalism, and we have to it's much more radical than whether you use timber or don't use timber, is my view.
Yeah, I think it's interesting, that 110,000 figure that Peter flagged up as well, because you look at that and actually, there's 47,000 houses in Scotland that are unoccupied. If you retrofitted those and brought those up to habitable standard, that's half of the houses provided without having to build a new building. And yet we have these things where politicians like to come up with these big numbers and targets, and the industry likes to think we're going to build. And we just have to get off this train of production and consumption and resource depletion and just completely change the way we think about the built environment. And timber is a great resource. There are other plants you can use to make buildings out of, and other processes you can involve as well. And we want a pluralist, diverse approach that is, a part of a bioregional and a holistic approach to the built and natural landscape together. And that, we know how to do it. All the thinking's been done. The processes are there. The physics isn't that complicated. It's the economics and the power structures that are the problem.
Thank you very much. Oh, we've got another online question. Glo, could you answer it?
Yeah, so it's great. There are comments about encouraging Scottish timber, which was very encouraging, and agreements about the financial world, capitalist world. But also there's about legislation, a question about building control, not allowing, foundations not being in cement and concrete and insist on it. And maybe there needs to be some sort of legislation change as well in order for, designers to push certain things through, or able to push certain things through. And I wonder whether that's something that the profession can push through.
Okay, would anybody in the panel like to take that one? We'll let Ruth go first, and then we'll come back to you, Peter.
Yeah, I'd say foundations are an area where it is a bit difficult to avoid concrete sometimes. So I'm not quite sure. I think, we can focus our energies on reducing embodied carbon more on superstructure,
I think
reducing the weight of that.
The suggestion was that it can be done with stones and lime, and I've seen it done with gabions as well, but there is a certain amount of resistance from building control officer who are not willing to embrace changes, basically. I think technically it is possible.
Yeah, I'd be delighted if an architect came up to me and was like, we would really, really love to avoid using concrete at all costs in the substructure. And can we investigate using timber piles? Can we investigate using reclaimed steel pipe? And if there was a client who was on board with that, that'd be really exciting to, that's never happened to me before. And yeah, for sure, like it could be achieved with some timber piles to an extent, depending on the size of the building. And then if you could focus on like reducing the weight of the superstructure too, that would help things along as well. But if the structural engineers can justify it, then there shouldn't be resistance from the building control department. I would imagine they don't normally look at the structural calculations if it's got like an accompanying certification of design that's been done externally. So I haven't ever like really heard of using rock gabion baskets, but it's something which it'd be exciting if the architect, as the leader of the design team, was trying to push for alternative substructure. And I would say, as architects, don't feel like you've got some sort of imposter syndrome when you challenge your structural engineer, because the chances are they're like 99 times out of 100, they're just trying to fob you off, and they're trying to go down like the path of least resistance, where they can make the most profit because they can turn around the design fastest. So just keep pushing back against them and saying, you know, here's a precedent project which has used this. We think it's achievable. Like, please could you explore it further? Please could you give us some quantitative information on the embodied carbon of this versus what you're proposing, which is more traditional design. Yeah.
I think we need to have another conversation. We built 3 buildings this year without any concrete and or any plastic, and one of those had no metal as well. They were, you know, smaller experimental buildings like the one at Cove, but these things are possible. Frank Lloyd Wright was using gravel trench foundations 60 years ago, and there's a thing about the mass of the building and so on, but it's you know, buildings don't really need to be that complicated, and we're pretty intelligent, and we've got computers and stuff.
Yeah, I think the thing, listening to the comments about timber buildings and so on, the reason we're building tall timber buildings is because you use less foundations. They're lighter weight than traditional steel or concrete buildings. And if you look at London, there was a kind of density of projects in Hackney. And a large part of why the council was very in favour of them was A, residents liked them, B, they were quick to build without lots of noise and lots of waste, and C, you were building over Victorian sewers and underground train lines, bringing foundations down. It's very complicated. And the lighter the foundations can be, the better. And the lighter they are, the less concrete there is, etc. But there are other things. I mean, I'm working on a project. We're creating a mobile factory to take basically the factory to the forest and build affordable housing in rural areas. And we're looking at ground screws, because ground screws, you've seen them, they do for little buildings, like garden buildings, but there's a firm in Dundee makes massive ones about the height of this room, where they can do commercial buildings. And we don't, because people aren't taught about these things, we don't really think about them or use them, but the very little impact on the landscape. And go back to the gentleman there about the hundreds of thousands of houses. I didn't set the target, but if we're going to, you know, if the government sets impossible targets and it's just a number, it's not about where the housing is or anything else, what's required, what kind of circumstances are. You know, I know from the work we're doing to create a mobile factory, part of the reason for that is builders don't go to remote areas, to remote communities, because there's no money in it for them. But there's forest there, and there's land there, and a lot of it's community buyers. And when you start to look at that, and you think, oh well, they don't want to build there because there's 2 houses here, 4 houses there, 10 houses there. We did a study in my office. We know cumulatively around Scotland, affordable housing in rural areas is 1,200 houses a year. That's actually quite a big market. And the point about making how much timber do we have? I know from studies we did, to operate a commercial manufacturing plant for CLT, we have more than enough timber for the next 30 years, an existing crop we have in Scotland to maintain that, to produce the material for that. To go back to the thing about monoculture, that's the way we've planted it. It doesn't need to be that way. And there's a lot of emphasis now on introducing more broadleaf woodlands and so on, which is great. But it's a £2 billion industry in Scotland, the forest sector. It's a large part of our economy, and we shouldn't forget that. But it can be larger if we do more cleverer things to make it higher value and to be able to then afford to plant other things. So it's a long conversation we can have, Felicity, but I'm prepared to argue the case.
I'm going to ask a question to Felicity because I would like to hear a landscape architect give a nice answer to this. Do you think there are some ways that we could maybe use landscaping design to replace things which have become quite carbon intense? And I'm thinking specifically of drainage. This is an interesting experience that I've had. My practice also works across the UK, and in Wales they've now said that all suds drainage has to be above ground. And that itself has been an immediate change to everything that we do, because we're now looking at natural ways of managing water flow across a site, very large sites. And that's a Welsh Government policy that has happened, and it's transferred straight away into something that has a benefit, an ecological benefit, as well as something which everyone has to deal with. So as well as the policy at the top, we could say, right, okay, what's the positive environmental benefit that we can do from construction? So is actually that something that maybe landscape architects can be standing up and saying, look, we're doing some of the engineering on this project. It's not just the pretty bits around the outside.
That's already happening. I mean, hopefully that's what you heard me saying in my talk. Yeah, we do a lot of work in Glasgow looking at water management, and landscape architects are involved in the Avenues projects, working alongside engineers to look at water management in our streets. We are consistently now using rain gardens for drainage in urban situations instead of traditional drainage, and that is happening and becoming absolutely commonplace. So instead of taking water through concrete channels and putting it into the sewage system, we're creating planting beds in the streets, so the water just runs straight in and it goes back into the ground. And surface water runoff is a big part of what causes localised flooding in the UK. So this minimises flooding, but it also means that water is filtering back into the soil. And soil is a living system, right, like everything else. So and it needs water. So if you have soil that is lying underneath Sauchiehall Street without any water, it's dying, it gets aerobic, it dies, it gets anaerobic through lack of oxygen, and it also depletes through lack of water. So what we're doing also is helping to sustain our soil systems. So like I say, everything's tied into everything else. And forestry equally could become, as I'm sure you would agree, a really positive force for good in this country. And there are massive amounts of initiatives being run by organisations like Central Scotland Green Network and the Central Forest. You know, there's so much tree planting happening across the UK, and it's really fantastically positive. One of the things that I say to my husband, who's also my business partner, is, you know, one thing we can be sure of is that we will have left the world a better place. I tried to work out how many trees I've planted in my career, and I can't, but it's thousands and thousands of trees, and that makes me really happy. And some of them will end up in buildings, and that's a good thing.
Yeah, I think there's just one thing I'd say there, Felicity, which is about tree planting across the UK. The UK government is not doing it in England. They're massive targets, and they're not even coming close. But 10% of what they say they're planting, they're not doing. You know, neither. Well, there we go. No, it's fine. No, but I'm saying, but there's a lot of rhetoric about the planting. We had it all at COP and everything from Prime Minister and so on. They're not doing it. Here we are. We're hitting most of the targets, but it's not. We need to do massively more in England because it's a much bigger place for one thing, and because a lot of the forestry is just used as it's classified as recreational woodland, and so you go mountain biking or dog walking or whatever in the forest, but that's it. And so it's not the same emphasis there, so there's not the same priority to actually say what can we do with it.
Can we maybe take another question from the audience? Okay, I'll repeat this quickly. Yeah, I think we've gone over this a wee bit, so we'll go very quickly. But say, how can we grow the crop that we need, but not in a kind of monocropping way?
Might have to say about this as well. I've worked a little bit with forestry, but I've worked primarily with forestry in relation to wind farm development, where we're taking forest out and replanting it. And what usually happens is that you plant indigenous species around the edges of monocrop plantations. So you have a perimeter of deciduous native planting. I think what might be more interesting would be to explore mixed crops that are not monocultural and that are native to our country, which may mean that they grow more slowly, but that are a longer term investment, not just in timber production, but in the environment.
Can I just say something to answer your question? Because I think it's not just trees. If we were looking at the how do we sequester carbon, then the fast growing monoculture we have actually absorbs a lot of atmospheric carbon dioxide very quickly, to the point about 50 years, then it can stop doing it. And that's why we harvest trees. But also the fastest growing crop that we could have in Scotland is probably hemp, because it absorbs far more carbon. Now there is due to be next year a factory down in Jedburgh, the Borders, producing hemp insulation, which at the moment they get it from other places, but the intention is to grow it here. There we go. My assistant there has got the visual aid. And I've seen stuff in America at the moment where they're compressing hemp, not just to make it into fibers to make insulation, but actually making panel boards. And so there's another dimension to the possibilities of building materials there. But I think your point about is twofold. One is about how do we escape the monoculture, But also the other point I would make is about how do we take more carbon out of the atmosphere with what we're planting. Please.
Yeah, I totally agree with that, but trees are really important. They're not just important as carbon sequesters. You know, the trees are monumental living beings that have their own ecosystems. They are essential for human life, not just because of oxygen and carbon sequestration, but because they alter microclimate, they improve soil, they harbour other species. So we need to be planting lots of trees, and we need to be replanting our native trees, and we're losing our native trees. So, you know, we're losing ash trees all over the country.
I think, you know, this is becoming a much bigger discussion. I was recently on Mull on a European project, and there was with the ambassador for the North Sea, which is a 10-year project to give, as part of this movement, to give voice to non-human entities. And so listening to the sea and giving voice to all the beings that are in the sea and the floor surface, the edges, the air above the North Sea. And so we need to think beyond just being our own species of humans to what is this place, Scotland, that we are trying to inhabit in a way that sustains all life, not just human life. And so if we were to give voice to our forests and to our trees and to our land and to our plants and to our water, what would they tell us about the environment they want and our place in that? It's a very one-way conversation about what we want as humans, and it needs to be a two-way conversation.
Okay, I think we'll take one more question from the floor, and then we'll have to wrap up. So see, we've got a hand already anticipating. Yes.
I just wanted to add that also I think strength is always in diversity, and in woodland and the plants and the materials we want a spread of different solutions and not just focusing on any one material. I think that when we put timber all under one name, we forget that actually there's a huge variety of species and they all have different properties. And if we got better at actually specifying our timbers, knowing as designers, specifiers, engineers, if we knew more about what the properties of different timber species were in different climates, because they grow differently in different parts of the country and they also perform differently on the building in different parts of the country. So if we understand that better, we can actually specify a more diverse range, and that will help with keeping diverse woodland.
Anyone want to respond to that?
One small thing.
And then I'm going to get the microphone.
On the issue of all kinds of different species, when I worked at Edinburgh University, we did species and what the properties were, and all of that information is available. They've not been very good at disseminating it, but now you've raised it, I shall raise it again and see if we can get more information out there, because it's essential. If you don't know the properties of wood, you can't build with it. You know, you can do other things with other materials, but wood, you have to understand that they're all the species are different. They do different things. They're good for different things.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, Peter, do you ever commonly see engineers specify anything other than C16 or C24? Because that's what I've ever only specified. And
They don't even know what species that is.
yeah, I have no idea.
Do you know what the C stands for?
Well, I know it's the bending strength.
No, it's not. Conifer.
Okay, but
C16, C24, the conifer as the softwoods. You find D is hardwoods, oak, and so on. And so there's different strength grades for types of timber. I'm not trying to give you a lecture. You know, there's a lot of information available, but you know, my point goes back to, if you're not taught it as part of your education in engineering or architecture, then you don't know.
We get a little bit of training on different types of timber as landscape architects because we're working outside, and immediate effects of different types of timber are so much more evident if they're exposed to climate. So we tend to use a lot of hardwoods outside because softwoods rot really quickly. So use beech in children's playgrounds because beech grows fungus and that's toxic. So beech grow a mushroom that if you use it like a natural play, it's really bad. So we do have to learn more about timber, but I still think even as a landscape architect, it's probably very inadequate what we learn.
There's a more broader cultural problem, isn't it? Wasn't that research that children can only identify 6 plants, one of which is a Christmas tree? Do you know, so we're starting from a pretty low level.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I would say that earlier this year, SEDA had a series of land conversations that some of you might find interesting, which you'll find on the website. And it really talks about how we've got lots of different demands on land. And also there are lots of existing communities that are reliant upon land. There are many different interconnected things which we can be doing better. And one of the things that SEDA Land, which we've now set up in the back of that conference, is basically to say, okay, we can't just look at one problem in isolation. We can't look at one issue in isolation. We have to look at everything to see how it all works together in a better way. So please go onto our website and you'll find more information there. It's a very current topic, very interesting. And I think it complements how we're thinking about things in terms of use of materials and the long-term effect on the environment. And that's the whole point of SEDA, is that we don't just look at the one thing, we're trying to look at everything and try and see how it all interacts. And then it's up to everyone to make their own decisions about how you take that forward. So I can say thank you very much to all of our speakers tonight, to this afternoon. Thank you.